On the one hand, we've got Putin, who's managed to maintain his iron control over the population through propaganda and repression, all the while claiming that victory is imminent. He threatens the West with both nuclear and conventional attacks, and continues to sacrifice enormous amounts of soldiers and materiel. All the while, Russia's position is deteriorating under the effects of crushing economic sanctions, shrinking war supplies, lack of qualified recruits, and rebellious military contractors. Ukraine is in a slightly better position, as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has kept national spirits high, and the country continues to receive huge amounts of advanced military supplies from NATO, the US, and other allies. Even so, Russia continues to occupy large parts of eastern Ukraine, and the ongoing Ukrainian counter-offensive has made slow progress in retaking the heavily fortified Russian positions. The progress of Ukraine's armed forces, the AFU, largely depends on continued Western military support and high national morale. But with critical elections in many Western countries coming soon, many people have begun to ask how and when the war will come to an end. Hein Goemans, a military historian, expert in territorial conflicts, and University of Rochester professor, recently sat down to discuss the topic on CNN. His interview covered several possible scenarios for the end of the war, and how likely each might be, and just what would be needed for them to actually happen. In this video, we'll go over some of his arguments and dive into what they mean for the coming year. Probably the most important takeaway from Goemans' work is that we shouldn't expect things to wind down anytime soon. He has studied conflicts for decades and concluded that in many cases, wars don't end decisively. World Wars I and II are among the rare instances of major conflicts ending with total victories and the unconditional surrender of the defeated. The US Civil War is another prominent example, although in that case the losing side was not even a fully formed country. However, in most conflicts, both warring parties will do anything necessary to avoid a complete loss. This generally means that they change tactics, make some sort of temporary retreat, or continue fighting at a lower level of intensity to try and wear down their opponents. But for the sake of argument, let's first take a look at what a total victory would actually entail for both sides in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Before we dive into that, let's talk about another type of battle that we're all caught up in every single day, most of us not even realizing it. Here's the bad news. Data breaches are skyrocketing. Did you know, based on the 2022 annual data breach report, that there's been a whopping 41.5% increase in victims from 2021? And guess what? The risk of your personal information being exposed is growing every day. I searched for my own name recently and couldn't believe what came up. Addresses, phone numbers, it was all there. With countless databases out there holding everything from your name to your browsing habits, it's like an open market where your personal details could be sold or misused without you even realizing. For instance, cybercriminals from the SSN-DOB platform once stole personal data from brokers like Dun & Bradstreet to fraudulently take out massive loans under unsuspecting people's names. And a bunch of those annoying robocalls you can't seem to stop are because your phone number keeps getting sold by data brokers. But there's a silver lining. You can do something about it. Introducing the sponsor of this video, Incogni, an automated solution designed to safeguard your personal data. Instead of you spending years trying to manually remove your data from these sites, Incogni does the heavy lifting for you. And it's not a one-time thing. They keep an eye out continuously, ensuring that even if your data reappears, they'll be on it. Here's how it works. Just set up an account with Incogni, empower them to represent you, and relax. They'll handle all the back and forth, keeping you in the loop along the way. Think of it as having a personal guardian for your online identity, and with their yearly subscription, you ensure your data stays private year-round. So don't wait till you're the next victim. Try Incogni for yourself by using the link in the description. The first 100 people to use the code MilitaryShow will get 60% off. So take control of your digital identity with Incogni right now. Okay, Ukraine war-ending scenario number 1. Total victory. Let's get into it. A total Russian victory, which now seems incredibly unlikely, was pretty much the standard assumption when the conflict began in 2022. During the first days of Russia's invasion, it was definitely a real possibility. Troops surged across the border, tanks rolled towards Kyiv, and airstrikes rained down across the country. Putin hoped to quickly encircle and take control of the capital, capture, kill, or drive Zelenskyy into exile, and set up a puppet government before the West could take actions against him. This nearly worked too. A huge initial advance of Russian troops from Belarus took over Kyiv suburbs and pushed forward towards the city center. But thanks to remarkably clever tactics and pure grit, Ukraine was able to stop the offensive and deny Russian troops access to key points. While the war has since turned into a grinding stalemate of trench warfare, Russia did manage to pull off several surges which at times overwhelmed Ukrainian defenders and could have threatened vital positions. The areas Russia has managed to keep occupying, like the towns of Bakhmut and Soledar, have come at a huge cost. Most are now bombed-out shells, empty of people, and with little real strategic value to either side. Due to the cost of taking these areas, Russia also does not have the military or economic capabilities to actually overrun other parts of Ukraine. As a result, the total Russian victory that Putin has been promising is likely impossible without some major changes to conditions on the ground. But any path he could take to make these happen would also have some serious problems and consequences. For instance, take Putin's threats of resorting to the nuclear option if the West does not cut off its support for Ukraine. The idea has likely been to force their capitulation by presenting himself as willing to impose such high costs that support for Ukraine is no longer worthwhile. But, at least so far, this just hasn't worked. For one thing, no military planners or experts seriously believe that Putin or his generals are truly insane enough to launch a full nuclear strike on NATO targets, a move that would likely result in mutually assured destruction. This leaves the possibility of a limited or tactical nuclear strike on a target inside Ukraine. But while such an attack would no doubt be incredibly deadly, there is little reason to think that it would force Ukraine or its allies to surrender. Instead, a tactical nuke would probably harden Ukrainian resolve even further and cause the West to send its most powerful weapons to the front. It's also unclear how many of Russia's nuclear weapons are actually still effective. Most are Cold War relics which have been sitting in storage for decades with questionable maintenance. The other glaring issue with using a nuclear strike to force Ukrainian surrender is that detonating even a small nuclear device in Ukraine would risk nuclear fallout blowing back into Russia. The last thing Putin wants is to irradiate his own territory, making this a truly impractical option for actually ending the war. But Goemans also emphasizes that Putin does have some other options up his sleeve, even if most of them are long shots. One of these revolves around international support, which has been a serious issue for Russia from the beginning. Most of the world has either committed to supporting Ukraine in some fashion or made an effort to stay out of the conflict entirely. While some national leaders like Brazilian President Lula da Silva have blamed both sides and called for an end to the fighting, very few governments have actually given Russia any real support. Those that have are mostly either Russian puppet governments like Belarus or rogue states such as Iran and North Korea who also oppose the West. These two countries have been supplying Russia with most of its outside weaponry, such as the Iranian Shahed kamikaze drones, which have been repeatedly used to attack Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Arms deals like that are the only way for Russia to actually evade sanctions and export bans, but the equipment they provide are not nearly enough to ensure a real victory. This leaves one looming possibility which the West would really like to avoid: China lending its support to Russia's war effort. China's role in the conflict has already proven to be somewhat unique, as Chinese President Xi Jinping has had no issue posing for photos with Putin, who he has called his best and most intimate friend. Since the introduction of sanctions last year, China has become by far Russia's most important economic supporter, with trade between the two reaching an all-time high of $190 billion in 2022. The same year, Russian imports from China increased 13% to $76 billion, and its exports to China increased by 43% to $114 billion. A large part of this is the sale of oil and gas, which have long been Russia's most important economic asset. Some analysts have also argued that China wants Putin to set off an age of conquest, which would form the ideal political backdrop for an invasion of Taiwan. If China did lend its complete support to Putin, there is the possibility that it would make the West nervous enough to push Ukraine's government into some sort of lopsided peace negotiations. However, in many ways, China's support for the invasion is still only superficial. It has not supplied Russia with any lethal weapons, and its government has been vocal that this is not about to change. This is especially true after the 24-hour mutiny of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group and its chief Yevgeny Prigozhin last month. who is now hiding out in Belarus. The defection seems to have made Xi increasingly nervous about supporting a weakened, unpredictable nuclear state on China's border. As Ryan Hass, a top advisor to Barack Obama on China policy, recently wrote in the New York Times, Mr. Xi cannot afford to abandon Mr. Putin altogether. He has invested too much in the relationship, and Russia remains useful to China. But the bromance that has caused so much concern in the West has probably peaked. If Mr. Xi is to achieve his strategic goal of surpassing US strength around the world, he will need to rebalance his foreign policy to account for Mr. Putin's vulnerabilities. That may mean stronger Chinese support for ending a war that has backfired so severely on the Russian leader, and a potentially less confrontational Chinese approach toward the United States and Taiwan. Goemans makes a similar point. Basically, as Xi and his government have become aware that fully supporting Putin will undermine their own geopolitical agenda, the chances of Chinese involvement to end the war have plummeted. This leaves Putin with pretty limited options for securing a total victory. One possibility is relying on support from two Eastern European countries where Russia still holds some influence. The first of these is Belarus, where Russian troops could potentially mass and attempt another invasion of Kyiv from the north. However, seeing as this strategy already failed back when Russia hadn't lost nearly 50,000 soldiers and half of all its functioning battle tanks, a similar attack now would probably go even worse, since Ukraine is now armed to the teeth with advanced Western weapon systems and training. The other possibility is the involvement of Moldova, Ukraine's small southwestern neighbor. While Moldova's government is not supportive of Putin or his war, Russia has spent years sponsoring a separatist movement in the east of Moldova on the Ukrainian border. This small region, known as Transnistria, holds a battalion of Russian troops who has so far stayed out of the conflict in Ukraine. But that could change quickly, as Transnistria could easily become another staging ground for Russian troops to launch an offensive in the south. If coordinated with an attack from Belarus, such a pincer movement could prove to be a serious issue for Kyiv, forcing them to defend from two directions. But again, the odds of this strategy leading to a complete Russian victory are pretty slim. If attempted without Chinese weaponry, such an attack would have to take Ukrainian and Western war planners completely by surprise. Considering how effective intelligence has been at detecting Russian troop movements, there is little chance that this would be possible. The attack would also likely have to utilize some elements of asymmetric warfare, like mounting an effective rural insurgency or assassinating key elements in the Ukrainian command structure. Again, this seems like a very remote possibility. Finally, it would require credible threats of mass destruction from Putin in order to deter a counterstrike, something he hasn't been able to pull off so far. All things considered, there is now only a tiny chance that Russia could achieve a total victory in Ukraine, quite the change from a year and a half ago. So, what are the alternatives? Well, one slightly less distant possibility is that of a Ukrainian victory. While experts and analysts completely dismissed the chance of Ukraine actually winning the war back when it started, after a few weeks, many began to change their minds. As the tide of battle turned and Russian troops were pushed out of Kyiv and forced back into the east, it became clear that Ukrainians stood a chance of coming out on top. This still seems to be the case, although the path to total victory remains very tough. Considering just how badly Russia has fared on the battlefield, as well as its diminishing war supplies, internal defections, and weak economy, it seems logical that Putin cannot continue forever. Ukraine has become increasingly bold as well, vowing to retake every inch of its territory, and even launching drone attacks on Moscow itself. Still, there are several clear obstacles to a Ukrainian victory. First, while Kyiv has gotten enormous amounts of powerful military aid from the West, most of it is ground-based and generally geared towards defensive warfare. NATO countries have so far been quite hesitant about supplying Zelenskyy with long-range or aerial systems most useful for offense. There remain serious worries about these weapons being used to strike targets inside Russia, and thus escalate the conflict further. This does look to be changing some, as it was recently agreed that Ukraine will receive F-16 fighter jets and the training necessary to fly them. Even so, it's unclear whether the jets will actually allow Ukraine to retake occupied territory, as both sides are a long way from maintaining air superiority. Another big issue could be retaking Crimea. In recent months, Ukraine has become increasingly bold about its intentions to target and eventually retake the peninsula. This has come along with strikes on key arms depots and supply routes, signaling that a Ukrainian push to retake Crimea could come before too long. But actually doing this might be quite the challenge. Despite acknowledging that Crimea is Ukrainian, Western governments have been somewhat hesitant to fully back efforts to retake it, fearing that it could be a red line for Putin. Another issue is Russian fortifications. Recently, satellite imagery of Crimea shows a complex web of trenches, mines, and dragon's teeth set up around Medvedivka, a small town near the border of mainland Ukraine. The most likely strategy for Ukrainian forces would be to try and break through the land corridor between Crimea and the mainland, heading from Zaporizhia towards Melitopol and the Azov Sea. Doing so could split the Russian forces in two, while cutting off major supply routes into Crimea. Unfortunately, to do so, Ukrainian armor and ground units will have to get through the minefields, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and numerous other hazards, while also taking heavy fire from Russian artillery and drones. All of this means that a lightning offensive to retake the area will be difficult and very bloody. Ukrainian commanders know this, and are likely trying to bide their time until more cracks in the Russian defenses begin to show. That brings us to the most likely possibility for how the war in Ukraine ends: that it doesn't, at least not anytime soon. There is a good chance that the conflict becomes a lower intensity, simmering conflict, with both sides trying to outlast the other. This type of war of attrition is quite common, especially when neither side has a clear path to victory. It also seems likely that Kyiv could bank on such a conflict going their way, since Russia's international support is probably not increasing much. Ukraine may try to take back towns and cities where it can, forcing Russian troops to fight bitterly for every inch of territory, while whittling away at its troops and supplies a little more every week. With no real way to replace them, such a scenario definitely doesn't favor Russia. At some point, Ukraine may decide that Russian positions have been weakened enough to mount a final offensive on Crimea, or it may act more slowly, maintaining constant pressure and constricting supply lines until things become unsustainable. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov recently stated that he believed Ukraine can retake its territory by the middle of 2024, but it remains to be seen whether that is actually possible. The scary thing with a war of attrition is that as things get more and more dire, Putin may become desperate enough to do something truly stupid. Even if Ukraine is able to slowly retake all of its territory, Putin still has enough missiles to conceivably keep bombarding the country from across the border. If this is the case, then the only thing that can really stop Putin is him ending up in prison or 6 feet under, otherwise known as a Russian retirement plan. Unfortunately, even if Putin is removed, there is no guarantee that his successor will be better. Some officials in Russia have been even more vocally pro-war than the man himself, and if they took over, it seems unlikely things would just end. But let's say that Putin or his successor finally sees the light and agrees to enter into negotiations with Kyiv. Some people would think that this would magically turn into a lasting peace, but the truth of the matter is that that is far from certain. According to data from the US Institute for Peace, up to 50% of peace agreements between warring parties break down within 5 years. Even when both sides know that continuing the war will be incredibly costly, there is a strong incentive to avoid giving concessions to the enemy or show weakness, especially in a brutal winner-takes-all political system such as Russia's. This spoiling effect means that it is difficult to make peace last without an absolute victory for one side, and suggests that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia wouldn't last very long, even if they managed to agree on terms. Successful peace deals are also very hard to carry out logistically, often involving partition, power sharing, autonomous zones, and other mechanisms which can easily devolve into more violence. In any negotiations, Putin and his supporters would almost certainly demand that some or all of eastern Ukraine remain under Russian control, or at least be politically independent from Kyiv. Considering that Putin still claims all of Russian-speaking Ukraine as his own, that the country's Jewish president is a Nazi, and that Ukraine was never really independent in the first place, the chance of negotiations producing results is not very good. So to sum things up, from the perspective of Goemans and many other experts, the most likely way for the war in Ukraine to end is to not really end. Fighting will probably continue for quite a long time, but at a lower intensity of violence than during the first year or two of the war. Trenches and minefields will probably remain in place, and missiles will continue to needlessly kill Ukrainians who just want to live normal lives. And that's one of the biggest tragedies with wars. They are much easier to start than to stop. When Putin let the genie out of the bottle in 2014 and then again in 2022, he created a situation where violence may continue for years to come. Like so many other places, eastern Ukraine will remain a perpetual conflict zone, where nobody is really safe, and things can never truly go back to the way they were. While such a messy ending is far from ideal, as Goemans makes clear, it is the most realistic outcome on the horizon. But what do you think? Will the war end in a real victory for one side? Or will this be another example of a simmering conflict with no real end? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.